So this session is about childhood trauma. So childhood trauma is something that we talk a fair bit about at New Mornings. Trauma is a really difficult thing to learn about, and it's not an easy topic. So if anything that we're talking about or that I'm talking about today triggers anything for you, or you just really feel like you'd like to have a debrief afterwards, then feel free to give me a call and we can chat about it. So today we will talk a little bit about what trauma is. We will also talk a little bit about the development, the brain development, some of the behaviours of trauma, the impacts that trauma has to learning, and how trauma can impact on a person or a child's capacity to develop emotions healthily and to develop healthy relationships. So it all sounds a bit heavy, and it is. I suppose the main thing that I feel like, if we have trauma, if we imagine trauma as like a fruit bowl, for me, pace, no, say that again. If trauma is like the fruit, pace is the fruit bowl. So if you kind of hold that in your mind, pace is just such a wonderful tool. It really is a liberating experience to understand that yes, trauma exists, and trauma is it's difficult to deal with children who have come from a background of trauma. So that's the fruit, but the fruit bowl is the pace. So pace can just hold you and the children that we're working with in such a nurturing way. So maybe bear that in the back of your mind. Because we would usually do this in person, doing it over the screen, please feel free to pause, pause me, go take a walk, go out in your backyard, have a little walk, have a break, have a cup of tea. It's a real advantage doing training in this way, that you can just take some space if you need to. And like I said, if you find you're having any just residual feelings about any of this content, then please call me and we can chat about it. So I will just get started. So the word trauma can be used to describe lots of different things. So trauma might be described as when an individual feels threatened. It might also be the ongoing effects on emotions and on the mind and on the body, which can result from a very high stress levels that occurred at the time of the traumatic experience. So a traumatic experience is frequently described as one which the person feels out of control. Circumstances are happening which are outside of this individual's control. It can create feelings of terror, of horror, and of helplessness. It can cause abnormally intense or prolonged stress responses. It can overwhelm the individual so much that they're unable to cope with the experience at the time, and then they're unable to work through the emotions that they experience from that moment later on. So it's like a horrible feeling when it happens, and then an inability to put the pieces together afterwards. So a traumatic experience might relate to a single event in which the individual is overwhelmed with something. It could be a disaster, an assault, a sexual assault, a car accident, a school shooting, or it might be the result of a repeated and long-standing abuse. So maybe sexual abuse, continual neglect, physical abuse. So there can be a myriad of reasons as to what might make an individual go through an experience of trauma. So the most common causes of childhood trauma are childhood emotional abuse. So that constitutes as having like an emotionally abusive parent. So a parent which will constantly put down the child, maybe call them names, devalue them as a human being. is the most common. The loss of a parent through death, divorce, prison, or distance. An impaired caregiver, so a caregiver who's been affected by drugs and alcohol, mental abuse, or even disability. Domestic violence, childhood sexual abuse, childhood neglect, so physical or emotional, and childhood physical abuse. And unfortunately, most trauma occurs in children's own homes. So there's a quick review in your manual. You'll see some effects and impacts of childhood trauma. And look, we won't go into these in detail because it's not really relevant for you as mentors, but basically it affects brain development. So they have done some studies where they will compare brains from children who have been through significant trauma. It affects the development of their brain. Certain neurons pathways are not lit up. Certain areas are focused on that fight and flight area, so other areas are not engaged, which of course reduces cognitive capacity. Learning is just not important when you need to sort of be scanning everything to see if you're safe. It can also impact the ability to regulate emotions, and that's probably the biggest thing we see, is just that inability to understand what they're feeling and when they're feeling it, and then the ability to kind of ground themselves and calm themselves down. Their behaviour is very stress orientated. Generally, there's a general mistrust in relationships, and kids from trauma have to constantly deal with triggers or traumatic memories, and often they can't actually put the two together. So just a really quick review, the cognitive effects of childhood trauma. Like I said, there's just a decreased capacity to want to learn. There's even a decreased capacity to know that learning is important. There's a very little capacity in retaining information, little capacity to understand, if I do this, then this will happen. It's just everything is a little bit jumbled. The emotional impacts, so having an awareness of one's emotions and being able to regulate those emotions is really huge. It's a really huge thing. So the stress orientated behaviours, which I talked about, there's the 3 responses. So the fight response, which is for the kids in the playground, they might be aggressive, they might be swearing, threatening to fight. As soon as anything happens which might trigger or create an emotive reaction, they fight. There's a fight response. For other children, it's a flight. So primary schools might describe them as the runners. So when something happens that is confronting or difficult, or again, there's a trigger, they run and hide from what they perceive as a threat. The freeze response is another one. It's almost, in some ways, it can be the most dangerous because that's showing that the child is feeling so overwhelmed and so completely frozen, I suppose, in fear, that they don't actually appear to do anything. They'll just freeze. They won't really look like they're listening. They might blend in the background, or they might sort of look like they're daydreaming. So that's actually a dissociative behaviour where their body is so flooded with fear that they are frozen. So there's 3 of the kind of responses that you might commonly see from a child who's been through trauma. So relationally, children from childhood trauma generally have a lack of trust in relationships. They might not see adults as safe people or reliable people. They might have a decreased sense of personal safety, so there might be more risk-taking. It might be difficult for them to think of adults as supportive because you know, they've been let down so many times in the past, or they might just give up from trying to seek out genuine comfort from others. They might be cautious, have walls up. Some of our mentors might describe our mentees as just having walls up around them and taking a long, long time before they start to trust them as mentors. or they might be highly sensitive to what they perceive as insults from other people, which of course makes them very reactionary. So it might be a kid in the playground becoming really angry at another kid because he looked at him the wrong way and he perceives that as a threat. So there's that trigger response and there's the fight that comes in. So of course this might mean there's a difficulty in reading social cues. So they may misinterpret facial gestures as negative, critical, or even threatening, as I mentioned before. That makes social interactions incredibly stressful because they can't really read and understand, you know, what's going on in there with their friends. And if you think about a playground, there's like 50 kids, knowing, you know, knowing who's on their side and who's not can be incredibly stressful. So, traumatic memories. Again, this is probably something that's not as relevant for you to deal with, but it is important as mentors to know that some children who have been through a background of trauma may struggle with traumatic memories. It might come out with strange things they might say. It might be artwork they do. It could be memories can be triggered by strange things. So sight, smell, sound, taste, even physical sensations can create this sort of traumatic memory. So yeah, they do, it is something that children who have been through trauma have all the time, or may have all the time, and it's an element of learning to live with it. And if that happens during your mentoring time, there are some strategies that we can go through. But again, it's probably less likely that the traumatic memories will impact you, especially in the mentoring relationship. But it's important that we mention it just in case. So just go through here. I'm just going to briefly talk about the impact on daily functioning. So in your manuals, you should see a diagram which talks about the main three parts of the brain. So the neocortex, which is the higher order thinking, the limbic brain, which deals with emotions, and the brainstem, which is all about survival. So within the brain, there are different areas, and again, you'll see this in your manual, which are impacted by early stress. So probably the biggest part of the brain to be aware of is what they call the amygdala. So there's a way of describing it as like the jumpy superheroes. So that's that little part of the brain, and again, you'll see this in your manual, little part of the brain that when there's a perception of threat, it will jump to protect us. It's a little bit like how when you're a parent, or even if you're supervising children and suddenly, I don't know, you don't know where they are, or one of them is coughing, you think they might choke, and your pulse goes fast, you can move at supernatural speed to try to get to the child. It's like a rush of adrenaline, and it's exhausting if you're in an environment where that's happening all the time. Most of us can tell the difference between the amygdala jumping in to save the day, and we'll calm ourselves. Oh, they're okay, they're just coughing, they're not choking, it's all right, and you feel that adrenaline sort of dissipate. Whereas children from trauma, if you can imagine, that's the feeling they're having when little Johnny looks at you a certain way, or when the teacher is getting cross and they start raising their voice. That's the trigger, that's the amygdala that jumps out, and suddenly there's this like a hurling of stress that just courses through the children's bodies. That's the amygdala, and for lots of kids it's just jumping all the time. That's why things like calm down cards are used in schools, or there's this really big push for mindfulness, which is about sitting and being and just breathing and trying to help kids to recognize when their amygdala is just jumping out, and just calming that nervous system back down. So that's probably the biggest thing to be aware of. Children who have been through trauma, the amygdala does become what's called as overdeveloped. Because it's been used all the time, it's actually bigger. So it just kind of overrides rational thought. It's literally like trying to reason with a 2-year-old in a tantrum. It's just not going to happen without time and without certain strategies. That was just my dog snoring. So the rest is probably less. Yeah, so trauma definitely reduces the capacity of children's brains to regulate. That's probably the biggest takeaway that I can give you. Mentoring traumatized children can be really challenging. It can be difficult. It can be just so confusing. I would definitely encourage you not to try to work out your mentees, because the mentee you see this week will probably be different to the mentee you see next week. It's very much a matter of being in the moment. And I know myself from living with a child from a background of trauma, I will often try and think of the secret formula, or I might try to work out, this worked really well on this day, so it's going to work well on the next day, and it never ever happens like that. It is confusing. So my advice would be to take each day as it comes, each mentoring session as it comes, and just allow yourself to love them for who they are on that day, without a set of gender or preconceived ideas as to how it might go. So behavioural outbursts are often seen to come out of the blue, or they might be an overreaction over really minor issues. And look, to be honest with you, this is probably the least common example we have in mentoring. It might be more, because during mentoring, the traumatized child is actually getting their needs met, and it's a beautiful thing. Very rarely will they have a behavioural outburst, because, well, they might, but you'd be more likely to see it as you're walking your mentee back to their classroom and it's time to go back into the classroom. You know, as you say goodbye and turn the door, and as they go in, you might hear them yelling, or you might see a behaviour and you'll think, why? You were so happy and engaged with me, but it's because you know, well, they're leaving that safe place, and also there is no reason why. They just, behaviours, and there's always a reason. Well, there is always a reason, but we might not know what the reason is. So other children during mentoring might seem quite withdrawn or hard to reach. They might seem aloof, or do unpredictable things during mentoring. And it will take time and patience and persistence until the mentee starts to sort of be more themselves and allow their little personalities to come out. So I guess the keys to understanding trauma-based behaviours are to understand it, and maybe respond to the cause without so much worrying about the whys. And there's a lovely saying, which is the idea of being an amygdala whisperer. So that's just, if you can teach your mentee some strategies and model that PACE model that we talked about during mentoring time, they will take that into their classroom. There's some lovely stories we've heard of a mentor that was able to teach their mentee a breathing technique. He got really upset and used to get very angry, not with the mentor, but he'd come in afterwards and, at recess I got really angry and, I punched so-and-so. And so the mentor was able to speak into that and taught the mentee a calming down technique. And there's this beautiful story that following on from that, he would teach his friends, and his friends started doing these techniques that his mentor taught him. So it was like a ricochet effect through the school, and that was through Romaine Park as well. So very, very wonderful to have stories like that coming from our local mentors. So in order for mentees to strengthen and develop their positive self-image, a mentor is that significant person. So they're the ones that come to the school. They're not paid. they're regularly there. Even if their whole worlds are constantly changing, that mentor is able to be there, and they can turn to them during their time of need. So there's this beautiful, I guess it's not so much a theory, but there's a beautiful thing that happens within human relationships, which is called mirror neurons. So mirror neurons it's amazing. It's that idea that if I was to start talking about getting a drink of water, and if I was sitting here having a drink of water, and you all saw me having a drink of water, you'd think, I'm a bit thirsty. I think I want a drink of water. So that's the idea of mirror neurons. So it's we tend to copy what other people do in our social circles. It's a really fascinating thing, and do experiment with it, because it's interesting. If you just are having a conversation with someone and they start folding their arms, you will instinctively start folding your arms. So it's an incredible thing, and I think it's an example of how we are meant to be in community. So if we have positive, encouraging, loving, warm people working in schools, the mentee will mirror that. They will replicate that behaviour. They will want to be like you. So it's just learning, this is how a relationship is. When this person is with me, they look at me and they speak to me with a kind voice, and they're encouraging, and it's just that little bit different to everyone else in their lives. And that's a huge responsibility, but it's also a huge, huge gift. And the last thing I would want is for that responsibility to outweigh the gift that you'll give. I always feel that the mentors that are so worried that they're going to do a terrible job are going to be the best mentors, because it shows me that they're already so invested and they're already so enraptured with their mentees before they've even met them. So we think at New Mornings that it is so wonderful that for 1 hour a week, mentors are willing to offer a safe, calm and predictable relationship for a mentee, and that as a mentor you will actually be impacting a child's emotional health for the rest of their lives. So it's such a wonderful capacity. It's such a wonderful opportunity to be able to do that. Something else that's really, really important with mentoring a mentee from a background of trauma is that predictability and limits are really, really, really important. So it's fantastic to be loving and to be kind and to be nurturing. In fact, it's actually paramount. That's probably number one. Number two would be predictability and limit setting. So traumatized children or children from a background of trauma experience a change to their routines and their environment as a potential for threat. So that can be things around not attending mentoring at the same time each week, or saying that a certain activity will be done on a day and not being able to do that activity, or just not remembering to do that activity. Lots of our children from mentoring have found that consistent, like, mentoring routine is really important. So we have some mentors who've actually come up with like a visual schedule, and the mentee knows that we come together. I will write in my mentor diary for 5 minutes. We will play a game of Uno. We will play with some Play-Doh. We will run outside, play on the swings. We'll come back, we'll play another game of Uno, and that's the end. You know, so creating like a rhythm within mentoring is so fantastic. If you're, for some children, that's just too hard. Even creating a rhythm is too hard. So starting really loosely. So we come together, we kick the footy, we play Uno, that's it. You know, it can be anything like that. Or again, it could be there are 6 options and the mentee chooses 3. And that's wonderful too, because that gives the mentee a choice in a world where so often they don't have decisions. They don't have the capacity or the ability to make any decisions for themselves. So familiarity is really important to mentees. So yeah, it's important to try and keep things as predictable as possible for your mentee. If you are going to do something different, prepare them for that. Let them know what you'll do, where you'll meet, and then of course plan with the schools. If there are any changes, for example, there's sports carnivals or anything like that coming up, just be aware of that and communicate it to your mentee. We have some timers as well at New Mornings that you're welcome to use. They're so helpful. I also have a visual timer on my phone that I use. It's like a little circle and the time sort of ticks across really slowly. So that's another really helpful tool to use during mentoring, especially, I mean, an hour is such a short time. If you're a child from trauma, an hour is so short. So getting them having that understanding of what an hour actually looks like isn't it's an abstract thought, and children from trauma often live in the world of the concrete. So the timer is a concrete example. This is how long we've got, this is what we'll be doing, and this is when it'll be time to go. Some of the things that are really helpful working with children from trauma are some calming strategies, or some regulating strategies. So I would say number one, the best thing in the whole world is PACE. So if you, just to remind you, PACE is playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. So PACE is, like, if we all used our interactions with everyone in the world with PACE, I really feel like we'd have a better world to live in some ways. PACE is just that real acceptance of what the child's feeling without trying to talk them out of it. So we've all had examples in our lives when we're feeling sad and we tell someone that we're feeling sad and they say, oh, you'll be right, or that's not that bad, or oh, you're sad about that. And how deflating and frustrating and hurtful it can be when that happens. So I'm sure we can all think of times where that's actually happened. In contrast, times when we've said to someone, I'm feeling really sad, and they say, oh, I'm sorry you're feeling sad. I can understand you feeling sad. And it's just like this validation that it's okay to be sad because we all feel sad. So that's acceptance, just as an example. So PACE, super great. Learn all you can about PACE because it will really, really help you, not just in mentoring, but in daily life. If you have a mentee that has particular struggles, working out safe areas, and I mean, this is probably less important for you as mentors because mentoring will be their safe area. Breathing activities, sensory boxes, hopping on the swings, doing some drawing and colouring in, mindfulness, teaching about emotions. These are all fantastic things that you can do in mentoring, but I don't want you to feel like that's a checkbox list of things you have to do. Absolutely not like that at all. It's more how can you incorporate those things into mentoring without it looking structured or overly therapeutic. I think a lot of those things happen in mentoring naturally. If you have a student who really, really loves drawing, you don't have to force them to do drawing. They'll do drawing naturally. And likewise, you don't want to, if they don't want to go on the swing, they don't have to. It's just some ideas. We have a bunch of other ideas in the back of your manual that you can have a look at just to give you more options how to sort of integrate those strategies. A really good thing to do is to say something like, oh, Penny mentioned or New Mornings mentioned in our training that these could be helpful things for mentees. Do you want to give them a go? And if you have that playful attitude, like, what do you reckon we have a look at this? It looks a bit funny. Do you want to have a look at it? Have that playful attitude. 99% of the time they'll be like, yeah, let's see what it's like. More examples around that. Sensory play. Kids absolutely love sensory play, and often children from trauma, they have been deprived of that sensory play. The Play-Doh, the plasticine, the squishing up with the food, all that stuff was probably not as encouraged. So glitter jars, which are shaped with glitter, and you can seal them up and shake them. You can make these during mentoring. yeah, again, colouring in. We have mentees and they've requested for Play-Doh and they're in grade 7. So being open a bit to have a play with kids. Another thing that can help are heavy work. So occupational therapists have talked about with kids from trauma that heavy work is basically moving your body with a pressure. So heavy work is fantastic for all children. It can be things like climbing on playground equipment, lifting heavy books, opening and closing doors, jumping high, pushing against a wall, going for a run, stacking chairs, all those sorts of things that are pressure-based activities. Your mentees might really find that helpful, and it can help calm them right down. Yeah, and like I said, some breathing exercises. So they can be things like blowing bubbles. They can be things like blowing up a balloon, making craft out of balloons. So they're kind of doing breathing exercises and it's fun. Again, there's lots of bits and pieces in your appendices in your manual. So have a little think about what you've learned about childhood trauma. Take some time to process the information I've given you. Have a look through the manual, and I'm really looking forward to us having our catch up on Zoom so we can just have a chat about all of this content. And if you have any questions, just write them down and we'll have a chat about it. Thanks so much for listening. I hope it wasn't too arduous. It's the first time I've ever recorded anything on Zoom, so I hope it's come across okay. Thanks guys, talk soon.